Just a day after nurses manned the barricades on Wednesday, both sets of workers are looking for salary hikes, with their latest pay awards failing to keep up with sky-high inflation. Union leaders say they are willing to consider a one-off bonus payment and express dismay at what they've called the intransigence of government ministers.
And alongside that, they've chosen this time to strike. Last week, we saw over the course of last week a 73% increase in the number of flu admissions to hospital. We saw a 27% increase in COVID admissions. Many of your viewers have been concerned in recent weeks around strep A. We've got 5 times the normal rate of prescribing of antibiotics because of concerns with strep A, and we've seen more than a third increase in the number of calls to 111. So this is a point when the system is already facing very significant pressure. That's the point at which the trade unions have chosen to take industrial action, and in doing so they haven't been willing to work with us to agree national exemptions in terms of covering all of the category 1, category 2 life-threatening and emergency calls.
Steve Barclay, the British Health Minister there. Well, let's cross over to Arise correspondent Laurie Laird in London, who has more on this story and the rest of the day's business headlines. Good to talk with you, Laurie. Tell us more about this latest strike.
Forgive me for sneezing there, Charles. I've had a bit of an allergy attack today. Yep, another day, another healthcare strike here in the UK. Today it is ambulance workers. And as we saw from that quote from Steve Barclay, the health minister, it does not appear that ambulance workers and the government are even on speaking terms. Steve Barclay's comments were very ill received from the striking ambulance workers. So it doesn't look like there's any chance of ministers and ambulance workers getting around the table anytime soon.
Well, I mean, we're just looking a moment ago at pictures of Steve Barclay there. I mean, government ministers in Britain have said that higher pay rises will only fuel inflation, which is, of course, a big problem at the moment. Are they correct in your assessment?
Well, and it's such a good point, Charles, because this is the line the government has been sticking to, that if pay rises were to go any higher, this would fuel what they refer to as a wage price spiral. And that means that if pay rises, if certain industries were to have pay rises, that means that the price of those services would increase, thereby fueling inflation even further, thereby fueling a request yet again for above inflation pay rises. And it's an economic theory, and it's something that we saw happen in the late 1970s and early 1980s when we last saw inflation as high as it is. But there are many, many differences between now and then, Charles. And the biggest is that there are so few workers in comparison at the moment that are unionized. Only about 10%, 13% of the UK economy is unionized and therefore covered by collective pay bargains. So even if we saw higher wage hikes in some of these public sector areas, it wouldn't necessarily fuel inflation. Furthermore, public sector pay is falling so far behind the prevailing rate of inflation. Public sector pay rising at about 2.7% a year, inflation between 10 and 11% per year. Meanwhile, private sector pay is rising by about 6.7% a year. So when you look at it that way, you can see the grievance that the public sector workers and these medical workers have. But because so few workers are covered by these collective pay agreements, it's not automatic that we would see the wage price spiral that we have seen in decades past.
And Laurie, I don't know if you touched on this earlier, but I mean, we know that public sector borrowing has risen to a record high in November. How do you factor all that in?
And certainly this is something that the government has tried to get out there today, has commented on the news programs today, almost as a way of saying to public sector workers, look, borrowing is so high, we couldn't possibly entertain a pay hike for you all. And in fact, public sector borrowing is very, very high for November, £22 billion pounds. That's almost 3 times as much as the same month of last year when borrowing was just over 8.3 billion. There are a couple of reasons for this very, very high public borrowing in November. And the biggest reason, Charles, is because of the energy price guarantee. This is the scheme introduced by Liz Truss during her short-lived time as Prime Minister, extended to a certain extent by current Chancellor Jeremy Hunt. And this is a way of limiting energy bills for both households and businesses. This is the biggest drain on the exchequer in November. There are also things like higher interest payments on government debt because of inflation. But on the other hand, government receipts were up quite a bit in November compared to last year because the job market remains pretty strong. And if I can stay on the jobs market just for a moment, because the jobs market is pretty tight, unemployment, it's ticking up, but we're still at 3.7%, which is very close to a 40-year low. That links into the reason that we are seeing so much industrial unrest in the UK. People feel much more confident striking if they know that they can go out and get a job somewhere else. When labor is scarce, laborers feel much more comfortable in striking.
Well, Laurie, we've got about a minute and a half or so left, and I want to see if we can get to a couple of questions before we have to end the chat. We've been hearing a lot about recessions, but I mean, it seems as if consumers are still willing to spend money on sportswear, particularly that bearing a Nike label.
Absolutely. Nike with some really good results in the 3 months ending in November. Revenues up 17% and even higher in North America. North America was by far its strongest market. Revenues on footwear alone in North America up 34%. Nike shares up 17% today, making up almost half the year's losses. Nike was down about 30% year to date before these very, very good third quarter results. And Nike says that they expect their full year results to be a lot better than they were telling us just a couple of months ago. So yes, it looks like the consumer is still alive and well, particularly American consumers, and particularly when it comes to something that has the Nike label on it.
Okay, sadly we can't get to the final question about Elon Musk, but it's always a pleasure to talk with you, Laurie. Thank you very much.
I'm sure we'll get to him soon.
Eventually. Laurie Laird.